Welcome to Divcasts from University of Chicago Divinity School. For more of our podcasts and information about our terms of use, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts.
All right, since Professor Tracy's keynote is the last of this conference, I would like to take a few minutes to thank the many people it took to make this conference the amazing event that it turned out to be. It has truly been a very smooth and incredibly intellectually rich conference. So in offering these thanks, I want to say that I'm not only speaking for myself, but also for the conference's co-organizer, Dr. Joshua Daniel. First, I want to thank Professor William Schweiker, Director of the Martin Marty Center for the Advanced Study of Religion here in the Divinity School. Professor Schweiker was enthusiastic about our idea for this conference from the start, and he helped us secure funding for this conference from the Marty Center, which was the most significant donor of funds for this event. And then as Josh and I worked together on the trying to imagine what this conference could be and on the logistics, Professor Schweiker was really invaluable in giving us advice and support along the way. And this was a process that took many, many months. I also want to identify the other donors to this conference, because it wasn't just the Martin Marty Center. This is a very expensive conference. So we received funding from the Divinity School, from the University of Chicago's Franke Institute for the Humanities, the Norman Waite Fund of the University of Chicago Center for International Studies, and the Ehrenberg Fund of the University of Chicago Center for Jewish Studies. I also want to thank Jody Woods, the new project assistant of the Marty Center. She took care of many of the logistics around the conference, like travel plans and scheduling dinners and other tax forms, the kind of things that we don't tend to think about as conferences go on that have to be taken care of. She came into this late in the game from another department in the university, so she had to learn how to manage conferences here in the Marty Center, and it's just been a seamless transition to help on this conference. I also want to take some time to thank the August scholars who joined us for this conference, leaving their homes and families and busy lives, several coming from afar to join us in the conversation. So Wednesday's keynote speaker, Marilyn McCord Adams, Thursday's keynote speaker, Michael Fishbane, as well as participants Pamela Anderson, John Hare, Aristotle Papanikulu, Myra Rivera, William Schweiker, and Michael Belker. I also wanted to take a few minutes to thank the PhD students who participated in the conference. They introduced the speakers, they offered incredibly thoughtful and rich responses to the talks, and then they moderated questions from the floor. So I would like to point out, or if you would rise as I call out your names, if you're here, that would be great. So we have Roland Lengel, Timothy Hiller, Jawad Qureshi, Rick Elgandy, Kyle Rader, Lisa Lando Hedrick, Herbert Lynn, and Crystal Plato. Let's get it. And of course, I want to thank all of you who came to listen to the talks and offered such generous and insightful observations and questions. A couple of announcements. Some of you have been asking about whether there's a way to get the text for the talks. We are videotaping all of them, So they will soon be added to the Martin Marty's website. So if you want to watch the ones that you've already seen, or you want to watch the ones you missed, keep checking the Martin Marty's website to see if they become available. Also, all the talks are based on chapters that will be collected and edited into a book. So that will become an available resource as well. I want to call your attention to the fact that there will be a reception held in honor of Professor Tracy after his lecture this evening, and that will take place in the common room on the first floor of Cirque Hall. After Professor Tracy's comments, the co-organizer for this conference, Dr. Joshua Daniel, will be the one to moderate the questions. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Professor David Tracy. Professor Tracy is the Andrew Thomas Greeley and Grace McDickens Greeley Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus of Catholic Studies at the University of Chicago Divinity School. He was also Professor of Theology and the Philosophy of Religions, and served on the Committee on the Analysis of Ideas and Methods, as well as the Committee on Social Thought before his retirement in 2006. Professor Tracy's work reveals his wide-ranging interests within the discipline of theology and his deep engagement with the with the hermeneutical work of Paul Ricoeur, Jacques Derrida, Hans-George Gadamer, the process theology of Rupert Ogden, and the mysticism of Simone Weil. His work has focused primarily on theological method and pluralism, emphasizing the role of interpretation and hermeneutics in systematic theological thought. He has also offered substantive theological reflections on issues such as Christology. Professor Tracy is the author of many monographs and countless journal articles. In his book, Blessed Rage for Order, he sets forth a revisionist method that sees a central task of theology as a critical correlation between the values and claims of postmodern human experience and the texts of the Christian tradition. In the book that followed, The Analogical Imagination, he presented a hermeneutical understanding of theology centered on the notion of the classic, emphasizing interpretation and the public character of systematic theology. His next two books, Plurality and Ambiguity, and Dialogue with the Other, focused on the need for interreligious dialogue and for articulating the Christian understanding of God in light of the radically pluralistic context of contemporary life. His most recent project, for which we are all waiting with much anticipation, is to be a 3-volume work on God, Christology, and the Spirit in light of interreligious dialogue. His Gifford lectures, entitled This Side of God, when published, will constitute the first volume of this trilogy. And on a personal note, I want to tell a personal story. I started my studies at the Divinity School before Professor Tracy retired, and had the great fortune of being able to take one of his lectures on God. This lecture was held in the second floor large lecture hall, and it was held once a week, so it went on for about 2.5 hours. It must have been the winter because the day ended very early in the day. It was an afternoon class. Suddenly the electricity cut in the building. There was no more light. So we were all sitting in the dark in this lecture hall. But we were so fascinated with the lecture, we pleaded with Professor Tracy to continue. And we sat in the dark while he continued to explain to us some of his thoughts about God. So it is now a great pleasure, and please join me in welcoming Professor David Tracy.
Especially Ms. Miriam Renaud and Dr. Joshua Daniel. And I'm especially thankful to Professor William Schweiker of the Mahdi Center, and you may not be aware of this, but you know the many, many really exceptional conferences he has sponsored, and this, he's retiring from the Mahdi Center, and this is his last conference. And I thank him on your behalf. Check the time. Or cut some. The title is God as Infinite Ethical Implications. Can it be heard? Yes. The infinite is not a univocal concept. Among the many different meanings of the concept, the most basic division is that between the quantitative infinite in physics, in cosmology, and the multitude of infinites in post-contour mathematics, as distinct from the ontological infinite as first principle or ultimate reality or source of all reality in some philosophies and some theologies. In its diverse, sometimes conflictual meanings, the concept of the infinite has been an indispensable category for many, including me. First, I repeat, as that quantitative category for space-time extensions in cosmology and physics, from Aristotle through Giordano Bruno, the first to say the universe was infinite, to post-relativity theory, where most would not say the universe is infinite. Most physicists, cosmologists, do, it's debated. Second, from the multiple mathematical infinities of contemporary mathematics. Third, and the focus of my lecture, the infinite has a vital ontological category as the ultimate actual infinite. In philosophy, Plotinus, Descartes, Cusa, Bruno, Spinoza, Hegel, Whitehead, and others. And in theology, Gregory of Nyssa, Dionysius the Areopagite, John Scotus Eriugena, Hedwig of Antwerp, Thomas Aquinas, Catherine of Siena, Duns Scotus, Nicholas of Cusa, Friedrich Schleiermacher, Søren Kierkegaard, Karl Rahner, Wolfgang Vandenberg, Robert John Russell, and some others. The ontological infinite names the first principle, the ultimate reality, as the source of all reality and the telos of all reality. So its meaning. Actual infinite is that, for Aristotle and many others, there was a potential infinite of the effects of the first mover, but not an actual infinite. That starts really with Plotinus, as I'll show. Unlike the alternative category for the ultimate, the absolute, especially for the German idealists, I believe that the category infinite does not, like the absolute does, close into its totality, but remains infinitely open, as well as internally related to all other reality, which the absolute, by definition, is not. Thus my preference for the category, the infinite, which with Duns Scotus, I believe, is the first, not the last, but the first thing one should say about God, if you mean God. This lecture is an attempt to encourage philosophical and theological ethicists to incorporate the category of infinity into their own ethical reflections on the good philosophically and on God theologically. It is a puzzle to me that in the history of ethics, unlike in the histories of mathematics, physics, cosmology, quantitative infinite, as well as in the histories of philosophy and theology on the ontological infinite, the infinite has played a minor role in the history of ethics, with certain important exceptions, like Baruch Spinoza, and of course in contemporary thought, the deeply influential ethics of the infinite of Emmanuel Levinas, to whose groundbreaking work I will return later in the essay. The lecture itself has the following structure. First, I will try to clarify at least the basic concept of the infinite in its origin. in Western thought. There was a great need for it to be compared to the various notions of the infinite in Hinduism and Buddhism and Taoism. But I do not pretend to do that here. It begins in Western philosophy with Plotinus in the 3rd century of the Common Era, and a century later in the theology of Gregory of Nyssa. He's the first theologian. After that, after to remind you of that history of the infinite, the main essay will conclude with an analysis of what I consider the possible ethical implications of understanding the infinite as the good in Plotinus, the infinite as God, as love in Gregory of Nyssa, both in critical conversation with the ethics of the infinite, contemporary ethics of the infinite in Emmanuel Levinas. First, the classical Greek belief in the infinite as imperfection, or what they would not call reality infinite. The classical Greek commitment to the form principle as the principle necessary for all intelligibility prevented Plato and other ancients from naming even his profoundly original articulation in the Republic 6 of the ultimate reality as the good beyond being. Sounds infinite. But no, it was the highest good, the highest finite good. For Plato, the ultimate as perfect must be definite, bounded, formed. Otherwise it would not be intelligible, but merely chaotic. Therefore, there could be a highest good, but not an infinite good. The infinite for Plato, as for almost all, there were some exceptions like Democritus, almost all classical form-centered Greeks, was formless and chaotic, and therefore unintelligible, and most certainly imperfect. You could not use it for the highest reality, ultimately. Now, despite his radical critique, unfair in my opinion, of Plato's theory of the forms, even Aristotle upheld the form principle as the key to intelligibility. He changed Plato, of course, by uniting form to potentially limitless matter, in his judgment, in order to formulate the basic Aristotelian principle of finite form and matter. So that his ultimate principle, the unmoved mover, or pure intelligence nous, was also not infinite, actually, but only in its infinite effects. So it was potentially, but not actually infinite. In either Platonic, Aristotelian, or Stoic versions, the form principle, I repeat, is the necessary ontological key to all intelligibility of the West, was central to most Western thought, in fact, from Plato to Hegel and beyond. Only in contemporary philosophy, in major thinkers like Heidegger and Whitehead, in their very different ways to be sure, did the category event replace substance and therefore form as the central metaphysical category so that the infinite could return. Event had, of course, become the principal category already before philosophy and theology in the modern period in the sciences for discussion of the quantitative infinite and in mathematics with counter. Now, on the ethical side of this discussion, which is conference is interested in, Plato, in what is his major dialogue on ethics, the Philebus, unlike Aristotle, had formulated, in fact, as people seem not to notice, surprisingly Kant-like set of rational criteria for ethics. Unfortunately, Plato left unfinished the obvious further question for those who read all his dialogues of the logical relationship between the ontological good beyond being in the Republic and the formative rational criteria for discerning goods in the Philebus. After him, Aristotle made so many major ethical contributions, as everyone knows, for example, on teleology and especially on virtue as the mean, that neo-Aristotelians can still seem intellectually untroubled that Aristotle provided solely empirical grounds for his ethics, like Kant and Plato. In effect, a Greek consensus ethic. In contrast to Aristotle, not only Kant, but also Plato demanded a rational criterion for ethics. Not until 7 centuries after both Plato and Aristotle did someone propose an active positive infinity, namely Plotinus, the most original ancient thinker since Plato and Aristotle. Second, Plotinus on the infinite as perfect. Plotinus considered himself simply a faithful interpreter of Plato. He certainly did not consider himself, as we all call him since the 19th century, a Neoplatonist, the first and most original. On the topic of infinity, Plotinus implicitly and occasionally explicitly held what Plato and Aristotle explicitly denied, that ultimate reality is actually infinite. Plotinus explicated what his hero Plato had left more suggestive than conceptualized, namely the fuller ontological meaning of Plato's The Good Beyond Being of the Republic as bearing an intrinsic metaphysical relationship to the one of Plato's Parmenides. Now, the Plotinian metaphysics of the one as the good, as ultimate reality and first principle, was indeed ontological, but actually more a henology than an ontology. The one as the dynamic living real is also the good. That's the one dash good. It's hard orally, so say the one good, one good. As the ultimate source radiates for both being ontology and intelligence epistemology, henology is the key, in other words, to ever lower levels of the famous Plotinian hierarchy of reality. The one as the good is our ultimate source and end, but it neither consciously chooses nor cares for us. Rather, the one, precisely as the impersonal good, unconsciously and generously, metaphor, overflows to emanate all reality. From pure intelligence or nous, going down the hierarchy to psyche or soul, to cosmos, and lowest, the negative infinity of matter. Plotinus. For Plotinus, matter is the very bottom of the Plotinian hierarchy of reality, and is therefore interpreted as the negative infinity, really in a way constituting the exact opposite in the hierarchy to the one as the good, the positive infinity, first to say that, at the top of the hierarchy. In summary, Plotinus insisted that the fundamental reality, or perhaps more accurately, the fundamental ineffable principle and source of all reality, is indeed, as Plato said, beyond being, in an exact metaphysical sense. The impersonal ultimate reality, on a few occasions you will say the personal divine he, but I think merely metaphorically, is one. But even the one, for Plotinus, is finally only a name, a necessary but still inadequate name for the ineffable but dynamic, the living first principle, the ultimate source and end of all reality. For Plotinus, therefore, the infinite one or good is indeed not an adequate name. It is merely the least inadequate name we can have for ultimate reality, rather like the name Tao as the least inadequate name, but finally not adequate either in Taoism. The one or good names what cannot be named. It is, after all, both linguistically ineffable and epistemologically apophatic. The infinite one, precisely as one, is the infinite source of the many, the finite many, arranged hierarchically. And therefore, for Plotinus, the one answers his one, his infinite one, answers, he believed, the ultimate Greek philosophical question, the metaphysical relationship of the one and the many. The one is the unnameable first principle, the one which radiates or emanates, but not creates, the many. For Plotinus, all being is constituted as many finite beings by the power of the infinite one. The one is infinite, is therefore formless, beingless, intelligenceless, boundless, infinite. The one is unlimited and indeterminate. It cannot therefore be defined finally, save as infinite, that is to say, apophatically infinite, indeterminate, aparon, ariston. But the one is also the good, which radiates all reality, which is good. Reality is good for Plotinus, impersonally, but generously, unconsciously, uncaringly, completely unlike, in that sense, the caring, intelligent, merciful, and just, biblical and Quranic God, who is love, who is conscious, who does care. But the living one as the good overflows, radiates, emanates the whole of reality. Iris Murdoch has recently returned to that idea of Plotinus. All reality, save the infinitely negative matter at the bottom of the hierarchy, is good. Paradoxically, even matter, at least when it receives the beautiful form of the finite cosmos, cosmos is beautiful, cosmic religion is good. Indeed, for Plotinus, here explicitly against contemporary Gnostics, and implicitly with the Bible's affirmation of the goodness of all finite reality, is good. Indeed, this gentle and generous man, usually serene, Plotinus, was uncharacteristically polemic, even angry, in his comments towards the Gnostic disparagement of cosmic reality as not good. Not only does the one as good emanate, or reality therefore, but it also attracts, like a great ultimate magnet, everything back to itself, back home, homeward bound. In its ascent, following the descent, in its ascent, first to the highest dimension we can reach on our own, nous, contemplative nous. We really meant Aristotle. Second. Followed at rare times by the power of the good itself to a vision of the transient but deeply affecting union with the one good. The infinite, the soul towards the infinite good, infinitely longs to return. But it finds its penultimate home in the contemplative nous, after the dialectical, discursive use of reason prior to that. It's a very good argument. No further intellectual or moral disciplines can any longer help the soul reach its ultimate source, the one or good. It can only reach nous. And in an unusual, and I think fine metaphor, he thinks of the contemplative soul in the realm of nous, which it has reached through great effort, as there waiting. All it can do now is wait. In his metaphor, wait on the shore to see if the tide may come in, the tide of the good, so that now the soul may be carried away briefly to it transiently to its true home by the crest of a wave in the rising tide of the good. In Plotinus' own life, according to Porphyry, the student, he himself experienced this union with the good, mystical, 3 times during the 7 years of Porphyry's study with him, but it was enough. The following is one of his descriptions of this experience in the Ennead 6, 732. But if there is some, quote, but if there is something desirable of which we cannot grasp the shape or form, it thereby becomes especially desirable and lovable until the love we experience is measureless. Yes, love here is infinite because the beloved is infinite. Love for her is infinite, and consequently her beauty is of another sort, beauty beyond beauty, end quote. Therefore, Plotinus is the first, for whom the supreme principle of the one is infinite. He said he wasn't changing Plato, but he was. For it is beyond form, beyond being, beyond intelligence, beyond care. For Plotinus' actual positive infinity, therefore, is no longer an imperfection as it was for the classical Greeks, including Plato and Aristotle, as I mentioned, but the infinite was now perfection itself, the infinite one as good. His purely spiritual one, which it is after all, contemporary, not an alternative, the material logos, the fated logos, in the eternally recurring fiery cosmos of the Stoics of his day, the ones whom Nietzsche, with his notion of amor fati, so followed. Nor is it the finite unmoved mover of pure intelligence or nous of Aristotle, nor even, because form the highest good, the good beyond being of his mentor, Plato. Plotinus' intellectual revolution is clear. He is, I repeat, the first to develop an actual infinite, not merely as in Aristotle a potential infinite of infinite effects of the first principle, nor merely a quantitative infinite. The effects of this Plotinian revolution have in fact reverberated through centuries of a good deal of Western thought, pagan, so-called Islamic, Jewish, Christian, and was rejected or ignored by many later philosophers. The whole medieval period, except for Scotus Eriugena until the 13th century, even Anselm ignored it, which is unusual. Plotinus also influenced a good deal of early modern and classically modern thought, especially, of course, romantic thought. We all loved him. As well as German and Anglo-American romantic and idealist philosophies. For example, Ralph Waldo Emerson's notion of the vast, the infinite vast. 3, Gregory's, the infinite love in God, or the infinite God who is love, combined to infinite human desire, or what he calls epitasis, stretching out. Gregory's work of his later, more mystical years, The Life of Moses, written more than 10 years after his earlier dialectical arguments against Eunomius, has become a classical, spiritual, and mystical text. In his later works, The Life of Moses, and especially his commentary on the Song of Songs, influenced, of course, by Origen, Gregory turned his attention away from his earlier dialectical debates and from discursive reason, therefore, to work out the fuller implications for a Christian way of life and thought of a God who, and he's the first to say this theologically, who is infinite, and as infinite is necessarily incomprehensible to any finite mind. Now, Gregory's philosophical and theological oeuvre demonstrates well the error, I think, of yet another classic Western bipolar opposition. Philosophically, an opposition between philosophy as theory and philosophy as a way of life. The ancients would not hold, and most moderns do. As argued for in our own period by Pierre Hadot, Michel Foucault, Arnold Davidson, Martha Nussbaum, and several others, attempting to recover that ancient notion. Second, and even more false binary opposition in some ethics, between contemplation and action, which for Gregory can never be separated. Third, a related modern theological binary opposition between theology and spirituality. That's roughly from scholasticism forward. Now, in his earlier dialectical works against Eunomius, Gregory forged rigorous arguments and propositions defending the doctrines of Nicaea and First Constantinople, which was part of the Latin. Nevertheless, these early works are different in genre and tone, but not in content, from his later contemplative, mystical texts like Moses' commentary on Song of Songs and others. In fact, in my judgment, few thinkers have been at home as Gregory of Nyssa was in using the full range of classical reason, from discursive reason and strict dialectical arguments and rhetorical persuasion, like Augustine, he was first teacher of rhetoric, to constructive speculation, and finally to the pure contemplation in his later works, including mystical. Gregory intrinsically correlated a predication of God as infinite. Notice a proposition that he forged dialectically in his debates with Eunomius, and he united that, this is to me it's interesting, with a novel understanding, peculiar to him, of our infinite loving desire. That's not peculiar, but what is peculiar is it's never ending. It's an infinite desire stretching out always in this life and in the afterlife. Very unusual for a Christian. To God, called epiktasis. This intellectual and ethical and spiritual transformation of all our desires and virtues by our infinite desire stretching out happens to Gregory when the finite self or soul experiences infinite desire, and through that contemplation of the infinite God who is love, united to an infinite loving action towards all others, the neighbor, the stranger, as other, any other, just me, the neighbor. The truly free and graced self for Gregory experiences this infinite stretching out, or epiktasis, I repeat, toward the infinite God. As infinite, first theologians do this, Plotinus was the first philosopher. God for Gregory, like the good for Plotinus, is necessarily incomprehensible. But I think it's important to note, as many do not, that he does not speak of God as infinite because God is incomprehensible, but the reverse. God is incomprehensible because God is infinite. Now, Gregory's innovation on desire was based on his somewhat odd interpretation of a metaphor rather casually used by St. Paul in Philippians 3:14 to 15. Paul speaks of stretching out towards God, straining towards God, epiktasis. Epiktasis became for Gregory the exactly right word for what we're about. Our infinite, never-ending intellectual, erotic, and intellectual stretching out to God in this life, and against most of the Christian tradition to this day, even after this life. Epiktasis, for the etymologically fascinated Gregory, points both to epi, towards the infinite incomprehensible God, while at the same time pointing in the self to ek, out of the self, outside of itself, in an ecstasy or ecstasis become an epiktasis, a constant stretching of the infinitely desiring loving self. Think how different from Augustine, his contemporary. Augustine restlessness is our problem. For Gregory, let's talk about our solution. Gregory's arguments with Eunomius were, for anyone interested in the central theological issue of naming God, a crucial moment in theological history, because he was the first to name God, systematically at least, as infinite. fact, File had said so, but he had spelled it out. I always seem to have said that. The 4th century inner Christian debate on naming God was clear, and Gregory was very much a part of it. So, 4, an ethics, a contemporary ethics of the infinite, Emmanuel Levinas. No contemporary philosopher has so emphasized an ethics of infinity more than Emmanuel Levinas. Now, one need not agree with Levinas's hyperbolic language, he admits of that, for the radical ethical exclusivity of the other person. At the same time, Levinas's ethics of the infinite good shattered Hegel's ethics of the absolute totality, just as before him Franz Rosenzweig had earlier shattered Hegel's totalistic concept of the state. In my judgment, Levinas provided a new ethics of the infinite, unique in our time, which was a worthy companion, I suggest, to 2 other contemporary attempts to recover platonically inflected philosophical ethics. He speaks in his comment on totality and infinity, defended it, we need a Platonic revolution. The other 2, Iris Murdoch, on the good, not God. And Alfred North Whitehead, Metaphysics of the Good and God, which was rendered into a full-fledged teleological ethic, not by Whitehead, but by Franklin Gamwell in his groundbreaking works, The Divine Good and Existence and the Good. Now, Levinas's ethics of infinity is hermeneutically dependent on his original, if controversial, reading of 2 major predecessors. First, Plato, in Republic 6, was mentioned before, the good beyond being. In Levinas' position on the good beyond being, he does not here appeal to Plotinus, as he might have, was joined to his second major hermeneutical retrieval, his reading of Descartes' concept of the infinite in Meditation 3. Through his own reflections on alterity, Levinas has maintained that Western philosophy has tended to reduce all alterity, all otherness and difference into the same, such as Hegel's dialectically inclusive totality. But on Levinas's reading, first Plato with the good beyond being, and Descartes in the 3rd meditation can help reverse this Western philosophical logic of a total appropriation of the other and the different into the same, because, as Levinas argues, Descartes' concept of infinity means an ideation or concept which surpasses the very idea of the concept, the proposition. For Descartes, in thinking the category of the infinite, in fact, I think more than I think. Through thinking infinity, I am finally outside the control of any concept of totality. I can finally admit the other and the different is not reducible to the same. That's a good ethical move. The Levinasian insight on the radicality of the Cartesian infinite and the Platonic good beyond being is, in my judgment at least, exactly right. For Levinas, the human other is manifested as infinitely other, in its ethical height and its implicit command by simply being there, before me, beside me, through its phenomenal face, with the most fundamental ethical command, do not kill me. Unlike Martin Buber's focus on the I-thou encounter, Levinas's ethics of the infinite is not an encounter, it is a confrontation by the other, which demands ethical response and responsibility. Furthermore, as a philosopher who was also an observant Jew, Levinas not only read Torah, but wrote philosophically informed Torah commentaries, many of which emphasize the traditional Jewish prophetic ethical responsibility to the neighbor as the Torah command. Philosophically, however, unlike in his Torah commentaries, Levinas does not write directly of God, he does in the Torah commentaries, of course, but rather in philosophy of what he interestingly calls, I like the phrase, the God who comes to mind. That is to say, comes to mind as the ultimate other, but for him only by means of one's admission of one's ethical, infinite ethical responsibility to the other person. Like Kant, we admire obviously, but different from him, religion is mainly, though not exclusively in both cases, morality. It's fair to say it's only some for Kant. He clearly follows that for all authentic religion, especially modern Judaism, which he interprets here following him on Kohan, as the religion par excellence of ethical monotheism, is the prophetic ethics of the other. My own belief is that Rosenzweig is closer to the truth on religion. Of course, religion must include morality. Of course, Judaism is an ethical monotheism, but it is also something else. As Rosenzweig's interest in liturgy, ritual, even in mysticism shows, even his openness to the Kabbalah, and his strong focus in the Star of Redemption on interpreting the great biblical love song, the Song of Songs, along with the prophets and their ethical demands. So it's erotic and aesthetic and ethical. Levinas, though he admires Rosenzweig as a great mentor, did not follow him on this. Rather, Levinas always remained faithful, as far as I can see, to his Lithuanian, classical, rabbinic, and anti-Hasidic background, which treated mystical Kabbalah and Hasidism with at best mild indifference and sometimes straightforward hostility. As distinct from Franz Rosenzweig, who I think had a far more inclusive and more love-centered position even for theological ethics, as well as in metaphysics, without the loss of the prophetic ethics of classical Judaism. But even if that's the case, even if I'm right in Rosenzweig, it was in fact Emmanuel Levinas who first articulated the first major contemporary ethics of the infinite. An ethics of the infinite that has by now influenced both a great deal of secular thought, such as Jacques Derrida and Maurice Blanchot, as well as a good deal of contemporary Jewish and Christian thought, in the latter case, such as Adrian Pepper's, François Smeltz, or Jean Magnon. Rosenzweig's position in today's now familiar theological language we'll talk back to, unlike Levinas, can be named a mystical political position, whereas Levinas's position is an admirable, austere, radical, exclusive ethics of the infinite other. During the same period in Christian theology, several political and liberation theologians and several feminist and womanist theologians, including, have turned to something like Rosenzweig, that is to say, an attempt at a mystical political, which I prefer to call it, a prophetic, contemplative position. such as Gustavo Gutierrez, Johann Baptist Metz, James Cone, Maria Clara Bingemer, Sarah Coakley, Dwight Hopkins, Aristotle Papanicolaou, and several others, have all argued on biblical as well as philosophical grounds that it is a serious misreading of Christianity to read it as either solely a morality or solely a mystical religion. Christian theology for all these thinkers, like Judaism for Rosenzweig, and as for me, is more accurately named that most of them mystical political, whereas I propose as a more boring but perhaps more accurate description, an ethical, political, and contemplative mystical theology. As far as I can see, maybe the person is here, if some young Levinasian philosopher or theologian, whether Jewish, Christian, or secular, could unite Levinas's profound ethics of the infinite other, to Rosenzweig's full portrait of Judaism, and to a full philosophy like that of the Star of Redemption, a major new ethics of the infinite other and the infinite God, related both to the Bible and to philosophy, could finally emerge. I think I will, and now I will speak in relationship with Levinas, go back to Plotinus and Gregory, but in the interest of time, I will skip Plotinus and just say, orally, in the first of the Aeneas, Plotinus does discuss the virtues, but the virtues for Plotinus do not include, as they did for Plato and Aristotle, the civic virtues, who are polis. Right? In a way, it's obvious. The empire has taken over. There is no more polis. But the virtues that interest him are the purificatory virtues, but it was the Catholic virtues of Catharsis that purify the intellect and purify morality. These he describes and employs, but not more than that. He was, in fact, clearly a very kind person, but he also took in many young people on his own, but the only polis he ever described was one that never happened because he died, namely what he wanted to call Platonopolis, the city for philosophers. We all moved there ever since. Plotinus' ethics is the ethics of a Greek sage. Levinas' ethics is the ethics of a Jewish prophet. Gregory of Nyssa, I maintain, like Franz Rosenzweig, is a good model for today in the sense that he at least tried to unite both the ethics of the prophet and the ethics of the sage into a single Christian theological ethics. In Gregory of Nyssa's ethic, like Franz Rosenzweig, one finds a theological ethics where both the infinite love of the infinite God, driving all virtues, and the infinite love of the neighbor could finally be ethically united into a complex but singular ethics of the infinite. Neither the infinite God nor the infinitely commanding neighbor need merely come to mind. Both are there from the very beginning to the infinite end. For Levinas, as you remember, the ethics of the infinite is the ethics of the infinite other. And then God comes to mind. One might say for Plotinus, the ethics of the infinite is the ethics of the infinite good, one's desire for that good. And the neighbor comes to mind. The most original move in Gregory of Nyssa, I repeat, is his notion of ekatasis. Now, St. Paul seemed to like athletic metaphors, the good ways, wings, etc. Hence this stretching out, this ekatasis, was for Paul an actual metaphor for our spiritual striving and restlessness as a never-ending stretching. For Gregory's own rich etymological and theological imagination, Paul's modest ekatasis became a metaphorically descriptive term for unending ethical and spiritual stretching out, whereby our infinite desire for God and the neighbor never ends, and one never wants it to, one is happy. For Gregory, each desire once fulfilled becomes an occasion for yet another desire. One is never ultimately sated, nor is one ultimately frustrated. Desire never ends, for we shall never be fully sated, much less bored. Origen, you remember, thought the fall was that since God was finite, the souls became sated, bored. They fell. The bodies, of course, was a Platonist. Not for Gregory. As much as he liked Origen, he radically disagreed there. Rather, God is the singular, infinite individuality constituted, of course, as a Christian by the three Trinitarian relations. More philosophically stated, that God is the God of infinite being, infinite intelligence, infinite love, causing always our own infinite loving desire for God and neighbor. Jean Danielou, the first one to emphasize epektasis as the key to Gregory, points out how revolutionary the choice of epektasis was, of constant stretching out. Because after all, for the ancients, change was negative. It was not a perfection, quite the contrary. It was a sign of imperfection, as infinite was. But in Gregory's new theological ethics, we are, of course, finite, as well as deeply affected by evil and suffering, but as images of God, which meant for him not intelligence principally, but freedom. We were constituted to always experience epektasis as good, not as unfortunate restlessness. John Henry Newman, in his essay on the development of doctrine, once famously wrote, quote, "It may be different in another world, but here below, to live is to change, and to be perfect is to have changed often." I find this consoling. That is a familiar thought for any modern person, for whom, unlike the ancients, change is our one stable reality, and it's good. For almost any ancient, however, change was negatively assessed, but here too Gregory was unusual. It was positive. It was a constant stretching out, probably influenced by Plotinus, either directly or indirectly, on infinite desire. Gregory grounded all purifying cathartic individual as well as civic virtues, unlike in Plotinus, in this increasingly transformative desire, transforming all the virtues for communion with the biblical infinite God of love, that for Gregory, of course, meant the Trinitarian God. Unlike Plotinus, Gregory's infinite desire demanded not only a contemplative desire for God and waiting, union, but also actions of love, working through justice, driven by an infinite love of the neighbor, itself driven by God, desire for God. As with Levinas, for Gregory, neighbor means any other human being, the stranger, even the enemy. Ethically, it has not been noted enough that the Cappadocians did in fact not only have an ethics of infinite love, but of justice, of social justice. Gregory followed his older brother and mentor Basil. Basil was one of the founders of communal monastic life, but insisted that any monastery, his own especially in Caesarea, had to have contiguous to it hospices, hospitals, refuges for the poor and ill, including, horribly treated in that day, otherwise homeless lepers. For Basil, like Thomas Merton in our own day, a contemplative life, individual or communal, also demanded an active work for justice, especially for all those marginalized by society. Another of his famous siblings, his sister, also an abbess with her own monastery, Macrina, who Jaroslav Pelikan rightly calls the fourth Cappadocia. That's just really made sure that her monastery, too, always provided food for any who came seeking, and especially during the frequent famines in Cappadocia. Macrina also provided refuge for all orphaned young girls. For all the Cappadocians, therefore, a contemplative life, which they're most famous for, whether in the world like Gregory of Nyssa, he was not a monk, he was married, he was a priest and a bishop, and the other two in the monastery. Whether you were in the world or in the monastery, it demanded ethical work for the neighbor, especially the poor, the marginally oppressed, the widows, and the orphans of the Bible's prophets, and the stranger. Well, there's more on Gregory, but there's always more on Gregory. Conclusion. The infinite task of theological ethics, inspired by, first, in our own period, Emmanuel Levinas, and then in conversation with Plotinus, which you can find, for example, in Iris Murdoch's Ethics of the Good, or in Jewish and Christian ethics. Jewish, I would say, in Rosenzweig; Christian, I would say, in many liberation, political, feminist theologians, could refer back to the Cappadocians for a mystical political model, especially for a greatness that was most speculative. I hope these reflections on the possibility of the infinite to inform a contemporary philosophical ethics of the good as necessarily an infinite good, and all theological ethics of the infinitely good God as love, may provide some modest aid for further reflection by experts, which I am not, in contemporary theological ethics. Indeed, philosophical and theological reflections on the infinite, I suggest, can be ethically fruitful. For first, any ethical philosophy of the teleological good grounded in reason. And second, for any modern Christian ethics of the infinite God as love. Moreover, if these reflections are at all persuasive, they should encourage both constructive ethicists and historians of ethics to pay, if they will, closer attention historically to other attempts at an ethics of the infinite in Western history, that is, other than the ones discussed here. For example, the implications of their different concepts of the infinite for their distinctive ethics in Duns Scotus, in Descartes, in Spinoza, in Schleiermacher. But initially, you remember, religion is sense and taste for the infinite. I actually think it's a much better definition than his later one, an absolute dependence, which can lead to determinism. But his sense and taste for the infinite, if he had developed it further philosophically, he might have been able to answer his colleague Hegel, who was always mocking Schleiermacher on absolute dependence. Well, Hegel, of course, was very good on that, and good infinite, very infinite. Perhaps it is not too much to hope that one day the history of ethics and the history of the category infinite in ethics will become as taken for granted as in fact different concepts of the infinite are in other histories. Histories of histories of mathematics, histories of cosmology and physics since Aristotle to the present, and histories, as I've suggested in this lecture, of philosophy since Plotinus and theology since Gregory missed them. Such a move would open, not resolve, many further questions, as indeed there are, both on clarifying further infinity, God as infinitely incomprehensible, and then especially the suffering, evil, and tragedy hidden, and on the ethics of the infinite. There I am the first to admit many further questions, even if I am right in this claim today. But sufficient to the day is the question thereof. The ethical implications of the concept of the infinite allows one to rethink what Descartes sensed so clearly, that the concept of the infinite, even in ethics, frees us to think more than we think. Thank you.
We have about 20 minutes for questions before we head downstairs.
Aristotle, yes?
I guess you're going to do it.
No, you do.
You me do it. I started over here.
I'm sorry.
But I'll come back.
Just one point about epectasis, David, but I think it probably is important for your project. I mean, Gregory is a great innovator, but epectasis plays a very large role in later mystics. So that Gregory does not in any sense stand alone. You know, when you think of
He's the first, isn't he?
yes, when you think of Hadwick and Eckhart on hunger and satiation, I mean, for a large number of mystics, certainly any form of satiation, either here or in heaven, is always at one and the same time an infinite hunger for more. So that infinity through the epectasis motif is a very important role in the history of Western
Later,
mysticism.
especially, I really hate it.
Yeah.
For whom the notion of the infinite is also.
Yes, yeah, right, yes.
But he did begin it, didn't he?
It's the first that I can see in an explicit fashion. You can say, well, are there elements of it in certain, certainly not in art, but are there elements of it possibly even in some extent?
Possible. Thank you. Aristotle.
David, there's just more of a clarification. So, clearly after Gregory, there are Christian thinkers who name God as love, but don't like the infinite, right? Like Maximus the Confessor, he doesn't like the infinite, because it doesn't convey the sense of satiation and enjoyment. You know, although he would never say that he never really stopped, he doesn't really like the infinite.
Right. Many don't.
Right. And then, of course, there's those who name, God or as the infinite, but not necessarily attached to love. And, I've always, we've always argued from a long time ago that the Christian naming of God is love. So are you saying now that, the Christian naming of God is love as infinite in that sense? And then Gregory,
Not as, but infinite love. Adjectival. The noun is love, the adjective is infinite, so not as infinite. On Maximus, you can help me because, and others I know who don't like this infinite desire, this epictasis in this life. Augustine would neither. Augustine doesn't say much about the infinite except in his work on Psalms and his work on the commentary on John. He doesn't say this. He's always interested, but he doesn't. I don't see in Maximus's critique why he doesn't notice that for Gregory, whom he knew well, infinite desire, non-satiation and constant desire, is joyful. It isn't as if it's, one can be tempted to think with the wonderful Augustine at the very beginning of the Confessions that restlessness is this great problem we have, and that we want is stability, satiation, rest, right? I don't think it, the alternative, as Bernie was saying also with later mystics, the alternative is not a denial of joy. It's another form of joy. Does that make sense to us?
Yeah.
Thank you.
And then I'll come back over.
Mr. Tracy, do you think that St. Paul has an ethic of the infinite, either implicitly or explicitly, in light of his claim that love never ends?
Yeah. An ethics of love, you mean? Does Paul have?
An ethics of the infinite, in light of his claim that love
Well,
never
he certainly doesn't have it explicitly, but I think it would be fair to say that. After all, I've eliminated lots of written talking about love. After the infinite is not a biblical term. It's nowhere in the Bible. It's a term that people actually begin with Philo, but spelled out with Gregory. And for Thomas, they now think may have read Philo, so it's all very complex in history. But it's a term, obviously, of a Greek culture, reading the Bible on all the majestic God, etc. But I don't want to claim that Paul, even I did try to be careful that Paul's notion of epictasis, I say, is typical Paul liking athletic metaphors. It's not there. He does elsewhere, Paul, the third heaven and all that, but it's not there that he does his infinite mystical work. But Gregory could not but see it when he read it. Gregory was, when you read him, he's like Heidegger. He cannot resist etymology. It's even in the wrong. So he's thrilled when he sees that. You know, so he's got it all. He's got it all.
Go ahead.
Yes, please. Yes.
Professor Tracy, I know your name and your work, so this is the first time I've been able to see you. Hello.
I apologize.
In Oneself as Another, Paul Ricoeur claims that Levinas's hyperbolic language creates a situation in which the other is incumbent on me. But he would have it rather, instead of being compelled to answer the other, that he was called to answer the other.
Yeah.
What would be the difference in a specific ethical situation, the difference in being compelled by the other and being called by the other?
Well, a call is not necessarily a compulsion. I prefer, I myself also said, don't particularly care for Levinas's hyperbolic language. He himself admitted it was hyperbolic. Yeah, but hyperbolic language has a purpose too, right? As Chesterton, who was always hyperbolic, said, otherwise people don't pay any attention. If they say something outrageous, and then I think, what? And start thinking about the other calls you, the other compels you, even for Levinas. Ricoeur's is more reasonable, I would say. But you know, Ricoeur told me that he was a philosopher unusual, a theologian too, unusual, who kept trying to answer the latest challenge. He was very famous, very young, as the philosopher of consciousness, of phenomenological consciousness and men of will. But then there was the challenge of structuralism. He took out years to answer that. Then there was the challenge of Lacan and Freud. He took out years to try to answer that. And he told me, he said, my greatest challenge was Levinas. But the whole last period of Ricoeur's life is in ethics. And oneself as another is, and notice what it is, how he tries to incorporate Levinas, whether successfully or not, into his own project. It becomes not just the other, but oneself as an other. So that you can also allow for some self-love. Right? I don't know if I'm responding, but it seems to me reasonably clear that you can have a call. I would much prefer to say, I suppose all I'm saying is I much prefer to say, as does Ricoeur, the call, right, than the compelling. But if the neighbor or the stranger is there, the widow, the orphan, the hungry, the poor, that's a call that is compelling. Right? Am I answering you? Maybe not.
20th century, I guess, and that is my question, the conversation between Schelling and Hegel somehow was also about this restlessness of the infinite.
Yes, it
Schelling
was.
was wrestling with the question how to get to some closure.
Also Schleiermacher.
Yeah.
So could you
Yes, I can, I think. You're absolutely, I'm sorry, you're right. I'm infinitely right, but you're absolutely right, which is less. My point is that the reason I choose, the German idealists, rightly point out, are the ones who made, well, Spinoza is the first on the infinite, right? But they're all commenting on Spinoza. And some of them are going to really the absolute. Hegel finally does. But Hegel does, I think, is decline only after he does the bad and the good infinite in the phenomenology, right? And Schelling kept with the infinite, which I admit I prefer, for the following reason. I mentioned it briefly. The absolute, by definition, closes. It is, as Levinas rightly argues, a totality. However, the infinite, by definition, Levinas is also right, both shatters all totalities and keeps open. Furthermore, and this is Whitehead's point, the absolute, you can have a dipole of more dimension, but Whitehead too, as far as I see, doesn't speak much, but he does speak of the infinite more than the absolute. The infinite can be relational. It doesn't have to be, but it can be. Even Plotinus, if the infinite one, which is good, is the source and end of all reality, it's related to all reality in this hierarchy that it develops, right? Whereas the absolute, by definition, is non-relational. So it does seem to me, at least, that's why I said also Schleiermacher was so loud. If he had kept with two things which he dropped for reasons I still don't understand, I just don't know, I keep asking Schleiermacher scholars, why did he drop intuition? And why did he drop, more importantly, religion in his sense and taste for the infinite? I think he did it because he didn't want to be confused with Schelling or with Schlegel on the aesthetic and wanted to make religion. But then he ended up trapped in a way into at least, not quite trapped, but he has a real problem with determinism that you wouldn't have if you had the infinite. I mean, in his later work, when it becomes absolute dependence, religion. And he has no way to answer Hegel's mockery without religion as absolute dependence. You remember the famous outrageous statement of Hegel in class about his college text door. If religion is absolute dependence, my dog is the most religious creature I've ever met. And he thinks that's right. But it's unfortunate. Schleiermacher could have had a full philosophy and theology of the infinite. He began with one, because after all, it's also Spinoza's on the infinite. But he decided not to. A book I recommend to everyone, which I read on this year, Francois Spinoza, you probably read it. Is Eckhart First's book, 25 Years of Philosophy, from Kant, first critique to Hegel's phenomenology, that 25-year amazing period. And his point is the following: that Kant, of course, rejects intellectual intuition, sensuous intuition, limit ideas. But in his third critique, paragraph 76 and 77, he does begin to speak of it. I think fairly casually, so he may make too much of it, but he does, for the first time. That's what Fichte takes up. That's what Schelling takes up. That's what Hegel takes up. Namely, that there can be an intellectual intuition of ultimate reality, either through the intuition of moral freedom or through an intellectual intuition, pure and simple. And it's at that second point, first is Fichte, it's at that second point that Schelling and Hegel begin to work out either an intuition of the infinite or an intuition of the absolute. And it seems to me that's very valuable reading of what's going on there, because it makes it then clear that the so-called post-Kantians, often called absolute ideals, are not a complete break from Kant. But Kant was so fictive as well. And then, of course, it's good that essentially he also loved the third critique. He said, finally, what I'm doing is playing colors. Kant affirmed. Well, but I agree with you. It's in a way the issue, right? I said further question. That's one of them.
This word actual is very, very vague, so I wonder if you could.
What? Sorry?
The word actual is a very vague term. It's been defined in a variety of ways. I wonder if you could give some indications as to what exactly you want to mean by actual when you say actual infinite.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah. It means that one doesn't have to stop with Aristotle. Aristotle in the physics develops quantitative infinite, which in fact lasted until modern mathematics and modern cosmology and modern physics. According to his wonderful book, The Closed System to Infinite Universe. Right? That's the revolution. And the first one to have a vision of it was Bruno. And before him on mathematics, Cusa. But Cusa would not, only God is infinite. Also for Descartes, by the way. The potential of the quantitative infinite for Descartes is not infinite, it's indeterminate. And many modern physicists, in fact, since relativity and quantum, have turned against earlier Bruno forward in understandings of the universe as infinite to the universe as indeterminate. I'm sorry. So Aristotle is very do what I do. Read the text. And the second thing Aristotle does in the metaphysics of Lambda is rather briefly but significantly speak not of the quantitative infinite, but of the ultimate reality, which for him, as you know, is the unmovement, that is to say, self-sufficient intelligence, nous. Right? That is not infinite because it would be imperfect. He's a good Greek that you need form for intelligibility, and form means finite. Right? But, here's his out, where we will see. But it's potentially the effects of the first principle of nous, the first common mover, is infinite. So it's predictable. The medievals, for example, many did not accept the actual positive infinite as an attribute of God. And you debate is the infinite an attribute of God? Because of Aristotle. It's a potential, yes, actual, no. So all actual means is, yes, it's really the case that the ultimate reality is positively infinite. I repeat, everyone like Levinas and me and everyone else, when we first understood in the Republic that the ultimate reality is not being, but the good beyond being, he's going to say infinite. He can't play because it's imperfect, it's chaotic, it's unintelligible. You know, the form principle is so crucial. And I think Plotinus is very daring to challenge that basic agreement, as was Weber and Nissa, because it's also quite crucial in theology. And it is, of course, a terribly important principle. Aristotle is, who's this? Aristotle, as you know, says Plato gave this lecture that he, as his students and others, heard and isn't in the dialogue, he says. But he makes, and maybe Plato did, no one really knows. He makes Plato ideas of forms, numbers. He makes it Pythagorean. I doubt it was. Well, to be sure, Plato was a mathematician just as Aristotle was a biologist. And that's a big difference when we're working after basic principles. So Aristotle is empiricist. and ethics too. He wants a consensus. He doesn't want, like Kant or Plato, some rational criteria to determine. But does that make sense? And that's why when it says actual, Plotinus noticed interesting. Matter is a negative because it's formless. And it's, by the way, chaotic, and it's incomprehensible. He even says it's evil, but all he means is privation. It's not quite real. But people who think he's attacking matter, it's wrong. I mean, he's furious at the Gnostics for saying reality is not good, not beautiful. It isn't. Once matter is formed, as it is as soon as you move up from matter to soul and cosmos, form takes over, right? So, but you see, Aristotle still stays with the form principle. He challenges this. He reads Plato, I think unfairly, as completely separate forms, and in fact it's numbers. But what he does really happily is he says form and matter always go together. Reality is formed matter. Right? And he has the best understanding of pure potentiality of matter, I think, among the ancients. But he too, I also, in metaphysics, the next step is going to be it's an actual, no, potential, period.
Let's head downstairs.
Yes.
It's about time for the...
We thank you for listening to or viewing our podcast. For more information and for other podcasts, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts. Copyright, the University of Chicago Divinity School.